Hello, Diane. Ready to record the first in our series of the podcast today?
Yep, I sure am, Aaron.
And what's our first opening topic?
Well, today we're talking about IT service management being a dynamic space and how it's undergoing rapid change, particularly with the adoption of AI-enabled tools and platforms.
Okay, so where are we going to start?
We're going to start today with the basics. How does AI understand human language?
Okay, the way it does it is a technique called natural language processing. So you'll quite often see the term NLP. In essence, the way AI works is it takes a sentence structure and then it slowly breaks that down. So computers only understand yes and no. Everything's still ones and zeros. So in order for it to understand a sentence structure, it needs to convert that back into that format that it knows. So for example, as it goes through the word span, it will cut that up into tiny segments. And then each word becomes what it calls a vector, but in essence, a series of numbers. And that's how it starts to break down a sentence in order to try to understand it. And from natural language processing, we can understand differences in sentences. So, for example, if I was to say, name all the football teams in the league, we understand that I'm talking about team in the context of a sport. If I say I have a problem with MS Teams, we know that the word team there means an application because it's something that I've got a problem with. And by breaking that sentence structure down allows us to start to look at that different nuance in that structure.
And how does AI then break that down into understanding?
So within natural language processing, there's two subsets. There's one called natural language understanding, NLU, and there's one called natural language generation, NLG. So when we break that down into understanding, the way the AI is working is it's saying, okay, within that sentence structure, where is my intent? So what am I trying to explain? Okay, so typically that would be what we would call a verb. And then you talk about an entity. So what are the things that are around that sentence structure, which we would call a noun? So you can see it's starting to break down those sentences into various areas that it can then reuse. That in itself is not quite enough to understand a sentence. You also need to understand things that are around it. And we call that classification. So it starts to break down things that's not a verb or a noun into things that form part of that sentence or part of that word in order for it to get to a point of understanding what it is we're trying to say. But it's very mathematical. It's breaking everything down into those little structures and into those little areas in order to therefore understand what we're trying to say.
Okay. And then finally, how does it turn that into being able to generate responses?
So in terms of how it does generation or NLG, basically it's almost doing what I've just described but in the reverse. Okay, so because it now understands how to break a sentence structure down, it then looks for potential responses in and around that sentence that you've just been asked. So it will go and look for data that matches what we've asked based on the way it's breaking that down. So we're asking for a particular answer, so it will go and find that answer. Then once it's found that answer, it relays that text back by forming that sentence structure again. So it says, okay, if I'm going to respond, I need to respond with an intent, so I need to explain my answer. I need to put a noun around it, so I'm going to explain how I'm going to explain it. And then I'm going to break that down into a classification structure so that sentence makes sense. So in essence, it's doing the reverse that it does when it's reading the text in to respond back to that text. And there's different ways that generative language is generated through AI, and I think later on in the series we're going to talk about how that works for different large language models and how it can do different things with how it breaks that down. But in essence, it's a reverse of the way it gets to the understanding in the first place.
Okay. And we're seeing NLP being used more in ITSM. What are some of the use cases where you're seeing the most traction?
I think the most obvious one, and probably the one that most people are familiar with, is the chatbot. Okay, so whether you find them frustrating or not depends on your viewpoint. But in essence, replacing that initial starting point for customer service with something that's going to capture the information in order to make it valuable, not just to solve your problem, but also to make sure we're getting everything we need up front, is one of the biggest use cases. And as chatbots have improved over time, we should be getting a more human-like response from them. And where they're implemented well, they have a little bit more nuance. So they're starting to gather information from people in a in a more human-like way rather than quite a structured way. Ultimately, their job is to get the information we need to solve the problem. That's the job of a chatbot. So a well-implemented one will be using that job quite well. And they are getting more prolific because they're just such an easy way to engage support. They're such an easy way for us to be able to have multiple conversations running within our support channel at one time without necessarily increasing resources. So that's sort of still the main area we see. The second area is classification. What AI is really, really, really good at is reading lots of information really, really quickly and then classifying it in a way that we need to make sense of it. So reading in thousands of incident tickets and then working out a correlation to what might be the underlying cause, for example, or are we getting a particular type of incident at a particular time or a particular area, or is there one part of the chain of our process that's falling down all the time? AI is really good at doing that classification and then allowing us then to focus on the underlying issue. And that's been a big use case in ITSM for probably the last 10 years because it really harnesses the power of AI and what it's still really, really, really good at, which is statistical analysis. So that's one of the biggest areas. And then I think finally, predictive analytics has always been a big thing in the ITSM space. You know, the more quickly you can understand the problem, the more likely you are to solve it. And that's going to reduce your mean time to resolution, which is what we really care about in IT. Okay, if we can't stop the problem, the next thing we care about is solving it quickly. So by AI going and getting those log files we need, getting all the information we need from multiple different systems, pulling that all together for us, so then as a human we can make the decision. It's really good at doing that, and that's probably one of the most impactful use cases within IT service management.
Okay. And what about moving forward, emerging trends, and just, I guess, starting with some of the more unusual use cases you've seen?
Yeah, I think where AI lends itself the best is where it can remove toil and it can do the things that we don't like doing or don't want to do. So a really good example of that is root cause analysis. You know, once we've solved the problem and we've either created a problem record about it or we've solved the incident, very rarely do we care about going back to write the documentation around it. So yeah, we should, but people don't. AI is really good at that. So you can get it to write the root cause for you. You can get it to mine. Maybe you did a major incident management call on a Teams channel. So you get it to summarize the conversation that happened on that Teams channel and pick out the salient points where you reached a resolution or you ruled something out and pull that into a report, because that becomes really powerful. And it's a slightly different way of using it in that a lot of the use cases we've focused on the sort of the front end into IT as opposed to the post sort of resolution of what's happened. But RCAs are really important as a really good opportunity to leverage it in that space. So that's one example where I think we can really benefit from leveraging AI. I guess the second more unusual way of using it is to use it in real time. It's got to the point now where it can give you a real-time response. So a good example is if, let's say, for example, you've got an intro on your help desk phone number for what's happening at the moment, or when somebody accesses your portal, you're running a banner that sort of says this is what's happening. We can get AI to update that straight away. So when it's seeing a trend or a problem, when someone then calls up or someone goes to the port, we can immediately notify the customer that we've got that issue. So they know, okay, I don't need to wait on the phone because they're already aware of it, they're already working on it, and it just takes away some of that overhead when you do have a major incident running. But just let the AI update that. There's very little risk. It can come up with a good banner. You'll take some case away, and that's an example of AI working in real time, which I think is where we're heading and where we're going. And I think that's a good sort of future use case. Not just future people are doing it, but I think we'll see more and more of that.